Consultant Forum meeting this evening. It's just gone 6 o'clock, so we'll kick off. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome Dame Sally Davies as our guest speaker this evening. I'm going to read, if I may, about her brief biography to introduce her, so that I don't forget anything of importance. So excuse me whilst I do that, and then we'll welcome Sally to talk to us. So. Dame Sally Davies is the Master of Trinity College, as I'm sure most of you will know. Before this, she was Chief Medical Officer for England and Chief Medical Advisor to the UK government from March 2011 until towards the end of 2019. She was a member of the World Health Organization Executive Board until 2016 and has led many delegations and WHO summits and forums for almost 20 years. Dame Sally, as Director General for Research in the Department of Health, established the National Institute for Health Research, the NIHR, in 2006, and was its inaugural director for its first decade. And in May 2020, she set up the Trinity Challenge, which she now chairs. Dame Sally advocates globally on antimicrobial resistance, and for 3 years, she was chair of the WHO Strategic and Technical Advisory Group on AMR, and later co-convener of the UN Interagency Co-Coordination Group on AMR, set up in response to the AMR declaration made at UNGA in 2016. And now Dame Sally is the UK's Special Envoy on AMR and sits on the UN Global Leaders Group for AMR. And what isn't written here, but I'll tell you, is that she's also written a fantastic book on it too. So in 2009, she was made a Dame Commander of the British Empire, and the 2020 New Year's Honours, Dame Sally became the second woman to be appointed Dame Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, that is a GCB, for services to public health and research. And Dame Sally was elected as a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Science in 2002, Fellow of the Royal Society in 2014, and a member of the National Academy of Medicine USA in 2015. And so clearly, without further ado, it is a huge pleasure and a privilege to introduce Sally to you this evening. And we're very happy that she's going to talk to us initially, and then we can open things up for a question and answer session afterwards that I'm happy to try and coordinate. Sally, thank you so much for joining us. And just so that everyone knows, I have asked you how you would like to be addressed, and having introduced you as Dame Sally, you did say that I should now call you Sally, which I'm doing so. So welcome, thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Justin, and hello friends and colleagues. And my friends on the call would tell you that I'm quite used to being called Sally or Mum or whatever. So I thought I'd just give you a quick kind of scamper through how I got to be here. But before I do that, I want to start with a big thank you. You've all been, or the majority of you, on the front line in COVID. And I've been on the front line plenty in the NHS. I was a haematologist doing sickle cell disease, but never as you all have. And I've watched the horrors, thanks to our links with Addenbrooke's and our daughter who's an F2 in Glasgow, the stress, the overwork and everything. And I do mean it when I say thank you. And I hope you will all get some break and not burn out, because I do worry, and we may talk about it, about how the NHS will catch up on the waiting list, which we would want to as clinicians, yet you need lives too, and the politicians will need you to, or my golly, they're going to be squawking and shouting. Still, how did I get here? Well, I'm the girl with dyslexia that wasn't diagnosed until a neurologist, when I was a young consultant, said, you invert letters and things. How did you do at school? And I said, well, I failed the 11 plus and came out top of the year at A levels and ended up at Manchester doing medicine because I didn't know what else to do. And I did a couple of years, and the equivalent of F1 and 2. But in those times, you have to remember I'm now 71, it was quite brutal. There was rationing and very few women, and I didn't like it. So I gave up. I married a diplomat. I escaped to Madrid for 4 years as a diplomat's wife, which marriage-wise was a disaster. He wasn't for me. But of course, What I did learn was how to work in the civil service. And that is probably a lot of my secret of success as Director General for Research and a CMO, because I watched it for 4 years, how it worked, how to work it, how to win in it. I also speak Spanish, I ski well, I cook well, and I read vast numbers of novels. But hey, I was pleased to be back in Britain and train, and I started and did pediatric membership, then did hematology, became the first specialist sickle cell consultant in the country working in Brent with a very big population. And I still remember from those times, a consultant from the Hammersmith just down the road saying to me, Sally, you're really quite bright, so I don't understand why you did red cells. You might have done okay in white cells. And of course, I'd gone to Central Mid to do sickle cell because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make a difference for a group of patients who didn't get a good deal. And I did not want to be condescended to by elderly white men. But hey, I've ended up at Trinity, so, you know, I'm learning later in life. I did that and enjoyed it. I'm very lucky. Every job I've had, I thought was the best job for me in the world. And then I get another job and I think, oh, this is even better. So I'm very lucky. And I still am in contact with my patients. Some of them, indeed, I went on seeing them and looking after them till 2006. So not that long ago. Well, it's quite a while, I suppose. And one day I got a phone call from the regional office of the NHS saying, you've set up in a district general a research program. No one else has ever done that. Can you come and sit on a research committee? I went. First year I said nothing as I learned about how the committee worked and learned a lot about research grants. The next year I made some comment. The third year I was asked to chair it. Found it quite difficult. I had a really good dose of imposter syndrome. There I was at a district general, you know, and it had been held by this chairmanship of this committee by Rose in his day and very famous professors. But I was promised support. I did it. And in that way, as NHS Research and Development was set up, I got sucked in. To start with, I became the chair of Northwest London, and then of North Thames, and then eventually of London. And there were regional directors around the country, and it was really difficult because most of the money was in my patch, and the others would want the money for research in their patch, including Cambridge. But I took a line that we could move the money if only we could show it would be better spent, but I wouldn't damage the hospitals in London until we could show it would be better spent. And some of you will have the history and remember how hospitals had to declare what they spent on research. And I still remember going to the Hammersmith with one of my team saying, you do not spend 54 million on research. Yes, we do. No, you don't. Yes, we do. Are you prepared to put it into your into your accounts and sign it off? Yes, we will. So when I eventually became the Director General for Research and we came to moving money and the Hammersmith came and said, you can't do this. I said, just remember that conversation. I said, I would not move money until I knew it could be better spent somewhere else. And it is going to be better spent somewhere else. And they said, but we don't spend 54 million on research. And I said, oh, that's quite simple then. Your chief exec and all of you go to prison because you misdeclared on your accounts. So one of the things you see is that I'm pretty robust. So I got sucked into R&D. I became the Director General. Actually, by mistake, I was enjoying being the number 2. And then I remember going to see the then CMO and saying, I've seen who's going to be shortlisted, and I don't respect any of them. So if you appoint them, I'm going to leave. Because I want to go back to my sickle cell patients. Meanwhile, I will apply. And he said, you're blackmailing me. And I said, no, I'm just telling the truth. And I was given the job. And having got it, I then set about thinking, what was the problem? And the problem was that we had, in England, I think arguably across the UK, lost how to do clinical research, which is much more a team event. And I persuaded the government to back me and let me set up the NIHR. So I conceived it with colleagues. We talked all around the country and improved the idea. We set it up and made it happen. I still remember the Cambridge response. Keith Peters and I are good friends, but we battled quite a bit. And Chris will remember it, and I can see you, Chris, on the screen in front of me, him saying, you can't do this. And then, well, if you do it, we think you're going to siphon the money off and it'll just go somewhere else. And I said, no, none's going in my back pocket or anywhere else. And of course, it was right. And one of the reasons Keith and I are good friends now is about 2 years into it, we met at something and he said, you said we needed to do this. Yes, Keith. We thought that you were wrong. Yes, Keith. We thought that when you started, you were going too fast. Yes, Keith. Well, we were wrong and you were right. And you can be friends with someone when they say, we could have supported you better, but thank goodness you did it. So I set up NIHR and I thought it was great. I was having such fun. Who wouldn't? By the time a decade later I gave up, I'd gone from having the 500 million that was embedded in hospitals taken out and reallocated much more fairly. We'd increased clinical trials to 1.25 billion. And actually, since I stopped, that's where it stayed. Oh, except for one hike, the ODA, which I got as I handed over as well. I was going to go on doing it, but then the CMO post came up, and I was having lunch with a mentor, and he said, "Are you going to be CMO?" And I said, "Why? I like doing R&D." And he said, "Well, why don't you have your cake and eat it?" And I had to say, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Do both." So I had a look at who was applying, and this time I went to the permanent secretary and said, "I've looked at who's applying for CMO, and I don't respect any of them. Sorry about this, guys, but they were all small men." And in fact, one thought he'd been promised the job by the Secretary of State. But of course, it's a civil service appointment at permanent sec level. And I said, "So I'll apply for it. And if I don't get it, I refuse to report as Director General to the CMO. I'm going to report to you." And he said, "Oh, all right." And I said, "Yeah, because otherwise I'll leave." So we did the deal. And then, of course, I was appointed. And I enjoyed being CMO and doing both, but it was very busy. And I felt that after 10 years, NIHR needed a bit of a shake-up and that it wasn't for me to do, but also I was becoming extraordinarily busy with global health and other things. One of the things I enjoyed was the fact that as CMO, I got to write an independent annual report, and where my predecessor had done kind of monographs with help from people, but you didn't know who, and if you were experts, sometimes you found faults. I thought I should do it differently because I was trying to make my young USP evidence and being open when we didn't know the answer, but pushing hard when we did have some answers. So I chose to do it, as many of you who've thankfully, and I appreciate it, contributed, by choosing a subject, getting in the experts, chewing it over, the experts writing chapters with their names on it. We edited a bit to make sure there was no advocacy. It was truly about evidence, and then all coming back together again, and me being advised what the policy implications were, what I could ask for, and then I, with the editor, who was a young doctor, would write that chapter of what the policy implications were. And in practice, I've had a massive impact through that. You look at where genomics is, it's because of that. Health of women, I was there before, thanks to Leslie Regan's support, there before the government got there, all sorts of things I was able to push forward. But the first one I did, and I can see Sharon here, and Sharon was a major contributor, thank you very much, Sharon, was on infection, because I thought this was non-contentious and that it went from community to acute hospital, to tertiary care. And so it'd be a good one to cut my teeth on with a new process and a new CMO. When people came back with their chapters, I'd read them and we were discussing, what was clear to me was that antimicrobial resistance had risen dramatically since I'd stopped seeing patients. I stopped in 2006, this was 2013. And I also knew that we had an empty pipeline for antibiotics. So there I was, and Sharon may remember it, saying, you know, shit guys, so this is a really bad situation, getting worse, what have you done? And what I realized was that the technical experts were not getting their voice heard, and that this really mattered. So I hadn't intended to do AMR, but I came out of that meeting saying, okay, I'll give voice to AMR, I better move this forward. And one of my strengths is thinking laterally. And I came up with the idea that I made happen the year later, that antimicrobial resistance should be put on the government's risk register next to pandemics and terrorism. And we got it there because of, I insisted, and we did some modeling to show it should be. And that was where my campaigning on AMR came from. And I can tell you about how it developed if you want. So, what do you see? Well, I've always been value driven, always about making a difference. I'm clearly not scared. I remember one permanent secretary saying to me, you know how you do things, Sally? You don't ask permission. I think you'd ask forgiveness. And I said, yes, but I've never needed to. I'm a very good judge at what I can get away with. And he said, fair point. You never have needed to. I think I'm very aware of where my locus of control is, that I take my decisions about my career, my family life with my husband, and what I do at work. So I know what decisions I'm taking. I actually hate bureaucracy, and I tried really hard as we set up NIHR to minimize it. And now I know it's got really bad. I mean, that's one of the changes it needs. But I did begin to understand how in the public sector, you've got to have an audit trail. So there's this balance between hating bureaucracy, wanting to move fast and get moving and make things happen, but having an audit trail and trying to find that balance. I think my strengths are also that I'm very pragmatic, that I'm strategic, though I can do detail. And what I'm very good at, I don't even have to think about it, is in conversation with people, particularly politicians and leaders, I will frame things so that it means something to them. So, you know, I'm not a researcher who goes and says, here's the dry data. I would go and say, you know, in your local hospital, this many people are dying every year because they have drug-resistant infections. Once they begin to realize that we should have done something about this, you're going to have a bit of a problem. So I would frame it so that they would listen. And that is a strength, and it's one that often clinical academics don't do very well. When I came to my retirement, and it was the most wonderful day, an afternoon of talks at the Royal Society, and then drinks, and 3 ministers came. It became clear, they were very humorous about it, that because I made my USP the evidence and I was so robust, that actually they'd all found me rather scary. There were many occasions when I would go into a minister's room and say, okay, civil servants, out of the door. And I still remember the first time I did it with Andrew Lansley, and I said, I'm going to say something that is probably career limiting, but I have to tell you this. I will always tell you the truth. Your decision how you handle it, that's a political decision, but I will always tell you the truth. So on a regular basis, I would go and say, don't work with that person, they're bent. Do listen to this person, they're expert. Look at this data, you've got to do something about it. If you don't take action here, I believe you'll regret it. So I would always go and tell them the truth. And I gather they used to dread it when I shooed people out of the door because they knew they wouldn't want to hear what I was going to say. But hey, that was the job. And then I was asked to stand for election here, and I never thought I'd end up in Trinity, first woman master, first non-Trinity graduate, or honorary or fellow, and it's a great honor. Though I don't know that this is the pinnacle of my career. I would think the pinnacle of my career is delivering on things throughout it, whether it's setting up NIHR, the work on AMR, or other work. But it's a lovely place to be. I hope that does as an introduction for you, Justin.
Well, thank you very much. It's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure that colleagues will want to ask some questions and perhaps pick your brains too. And whilst everyone's thinking about what they might want to ask, and if you do, please either just put something in the chat or put your hand up on the Zoom system or wave. As you said, I've got lots and lots of people to try and see, so let me know one way or another. I was interested to hear that even someone who's had the career that you've had to date mentioned imposter syndrome, which perhaps quite a few people on the call may be able to sort of bring parallels with. How have you got sort of beyond that process? Because it's not straightforward, I would imagine. Certainly for many people, they describe it.
No, I don't think it is. And while more women than men probably suffer from it, it's not limited to women. I mean, practice makes perfect. I only discovered rather later on about the faking it till you make it expression. You know, I learned to try and find the strength to go and look as if I knew what I was doing and do it. And in fact, I had one of those visuals when I was going to do things that I thought would be difficult, whether it was a meeting or a talk or whatever. I would stand outside, take a deep breath, and I have this visual of a crank in my back that I would crank up. Come on, Sally, you can do this. You've always done it. This one you can do too. In you go and do it. And yeah, I got away with it. And so often that I built my confidence. But it's not easy.
Thank you. And the other thing that struck home was you mentioned how that I think you said you were often, you didn't ask permission, you might ask forgiveness, which meant you just got on and got things done. And sometimes in the NHS that feels difficult. And I wonder how in your clinical practice, did you have the same mentality and how did you manage that? Or was it one of the reasons why you changed direction?
That's an interesting question. Yes, it probably is slightly why I changed direction. I mean, I got opportunities and I thought I should take them. I was the enfant terrible of my hospital because, you know, I'd have an idea I wanted to do something and I'd march in and see the chief exec and say, I've come for a cup of coffee and this is what I'm going to do. So I did usually warn them what I was going to do. And if there was a good reason not to, and I was told it, I would listen. But in general, yeah, but those that I did make the point that I'm older than all of you. And I think it was only later on that the business mentality and having to write a business case and everything came in. I can write a business case, and I did think a bit that way. Why would I want to do this? What are the pros and the cons? I'd do a kind of mental SWOT analysis without knowing it was that, and think through the benefit for the patients, the hospital, and everyone. But I had never at that stage thought of writing it down in a structured way and prosecuting my case like that. Later on, but it was once I'd left for R&D, that kind of way of working came in, and I recognized it as the type of thought process I'd gone through, and I write quite well, but I was rather glad I didn't have to go through that.
Thank you. And then just touching a little on the antimicrobial resistance side, and I mentioned earlier that you've got a relatively recent book that you've published on that, and and we've got some infection control doctors and nurses amongst the audience this evening. I'm just wondering your thoughts on what remain the major outstanding issues of importance and things that you'd want clinicians around the meeting here to be aware of and spread knowledge about. I know that's an impossible question in a few minutes, but some highlights that you think are really globally concerning.
Well, I think Sharon could answer the UK question better than me, but we need to keep moving forward with, in the human sector, infection prevention and control and appropriate use. In the animal sector, it's called biosecurity and appropriate use. And I'm very proud of our food chain people, because they have brought down by around 50% their use of antibiotics over the last 5-6 years. GPs have managed to bring down their use in different ways, but clearly there's a big understanding gap and behavioural gap, and we've got to work on that. Meanwhile, we need new drugs and better diagnostics. On the global stage, it's that with gongs on, but also the fact that the supply chain is very unstable, so we get stockouts, and you will remember the PIP-TAS one. It's almost impossible to get benzyl penicillin, I gather, and we don't know where they come from. So we've got no transparency. I find it odd that I can find out where my clothes come from and my food comes from, but not where my antibiotics and antimicrobials and the factories that make the precursor, the API chemicals, and then the antibiotics and antimicrobials are generally, not always, in China and India. And they're spewing out dreadful environmental contamination. Plus, we have massive contamination from fish farming and things like that. So there's a great need for innovation, whether it's about diagnostics, new drugs, better tracking of infections by genomes, as Sharon and colleagues do. Globally, there's an access issue, and then all these other issues about sustainability of the food chain, the environment, biodiversity, while delivering excellent care.
Thank you. Sharon, Professor Sharon Peacock, I don't want to put you on the spot, but Sally mentioned that you might want to contribute as a comment. Would you like to, or would you rather not?
No, I'm happy to contribute. I remember actually giving an opening talk about the complexity of antimicrobial resistance, to which Sally was there. And actually I drew a jigsaw puzzle with lots of different pieces, each with a different label. And I think the challenge around tackling antimicrobial resistance is there's so many points that you have to tackle. You know, there's drug use, there's fake drugs, there's use of antibiotics in animals, and the list is absolutely endless. And so I think that the challenge will really be trying to either take a completely holistic approach, but that is actually proving quite difficult, or knowing exactly where you can have the biggest bang for your buck. You know, where can you press on the problem to make the biggest gains? And I think that one of the biggest worries for me is the lack of new drugs still coming through. I think that's still problematic. There's been a lot of work to generate that, but actually I think there might be some hope on the horizon, because having been involved in the COVID response, the innovation in relation to COVID has been absolutely staggering. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot now is, what can all of this innovation do for AMR? How can it feed back? So are there mRNA vaccines we can produce for AMR type pathogens? Is there wastewater we can use for AMR surveillance and so on? And so I think that this may well be actually a turning point for how we actually do surveillance and how we prevent AMR pathogens. So that's what I would say. I think I'm more hopeful now, perhaps, after seeing all the innovation in the last year, than I was before the pandemic. So if anything good is to come out of the pandemic, I think it's going to be the innovation the manufacturing, the vaccine development. And I think that we've shown that we can do that here as well as other people.
Brilliant, thank you. And how fortunate we are to have two fantastic experts to contribute to the conversation. So thank you both. Sally, I'm going to go through a few questions now as they start coming in. The first is from Rob Hoschkel, one of our paediatric gastroenterologists, whose question is, what do you see as the biggest challenge for the NHS in the next decade? Nothing too big there.
You probably know better than me, but I mean, I think we've got a whole set of challenges, and one is, how do we keep handling COVID? Because we will have another wave, either probably because of a variant or something. How do we keep handling that, yet pick up the other people who need care? So there's that, when we actually need a lot more infrastructure and more capacity. And where's the money coming from all of that? Meanwhile, my latest book, which I wrote and published in November, and so just for those who don't know about it, with a young colleague, is all about what COVID has shown us about inequalities and the need to change society structurally and invest in public health and prevention. And I think the NHS has a role in that and should be doing some of that. But actually, I think it's a much bigger cross-society role that needs to be picked up. So one of the things I'm very excited about is I recommended in December, I have to remember when I wrote it, 2018, I think it was, that we needed a national composite health index so that we could look not just at process measures in the NHS, but at risk factors and other issues. And the then Cabinet Secretary actually commissioned the Office of National Statistics to do it, and they published it at the beginning of December in a beta version. They've been consulting on it. They've had 600 responses, and we will get a national health index that will measure our stock of health and be able to be put next to the GDP, because they're both national statistics. It will be a national statistic, but GDP, of course, measures flow of money. We want to measure stock of health. And if you look, I don't know whether it's still on the ONS website, it's really exciting because you can see how they kind of time marked it for 3 years ago. And you can see we've already lost health in that time on some things. Their well-being went up, to my surprise. And of course, COVID's going to put it back. And then the final thing I'd say, I mean, there's so much, and as you do know much more than I do, is how do we bake in the digital and technology advances like the science and innovation we got from COVID and not go backwards? And that, I think, is going to be difficult. And again, we need money.
Well, thank you. And I think that perhaps ties in with our next question. Miles Parks, who's a professor of gastroenterology. Miles, did you want to ask your question to Sally?
Yeah, hi, Sally. Thanks for that really inspiring talk. Great to hear your whole story, actually. I'm interested to know your thoughts about whether we've made the process of doing research in the healthcare environment too complicated. Have we, by building in all the, what may be viewed as safeguards or other things, we produce massive barriers to somebody with a good idea to just get on and do something? What can we do about that?
Yes, we have. So I think what we've forgotten as we've developed the system, my plans were much less bureaucratic, and we started less bureaucratic in 2006, were to recognize that it's, if you have equipoise, it is unethical not to do research. Therefore, we should want every patient to be invited to join in research, but of course that should be high quality research. Hence you can't just go off and do your own idea. You need to actually make sure you've got the right statistical power, proper randomization, or a proper infrastructure of a BRC or something if it's in-depth small numbers of patients, physiology, pathology, whatever. it's a team sport, as I said. But I do think it's gone to ridiculous levels. And the other one that really, I was so pleased when I did it, the Athena Swan became totally bogged down by bureaucracy and ticking boxes. And most places across the country, women were being asked to complete it and make sure that it all happened, and yet they got no recognition for that role. So we've got to have a real go at the bureaucracy and at trying to find that fire again. And that was one reason I thought that someone else younger should have a go at running NIHR. You know, that we'd started well, but it had kind of lost it. And I think COVID allows us a reset, because some things have been great about COVID. I do think it's entertaining and seriously irritating that Oxford claim all the clinical trials, because without all of you and the NIHR, they wouldn't have been delivered. But we've shown we can do it. Now we need to make it much more digitally easy to do small or large trials.
And of course, one thing that COVID has shown is how to do digital science properly. Yeah. And the unlocking of massive data sets has been a vastly valuable thing. And we just live in fear of this going back to the way it used to be.
Yes, I absolutely agree. So when I talk about bake in the technology and digital advances, it's about that sort of thing. And the Trinity Challenge that I set up this time last year was bringing together 40 collaborating founding partners from the top of Facebook, Google, Tencent, Microsoft, and universities, including Cambridge, to look at how we could try and prevent future pandemics, respond better, recover better by using digital technologies and data that the public sector doesn't have, you know, movement data, payment data, behavior data, and belief data. I mean, some of the stuff that Facebook do, and they're allowing researchers through the challenge to use, is really fascinating. And then we've got one partner, Cubic, who are actually in the business of being able to monitor whether advertising techniques work. And they can see if Facebook or someone puts out an advert in a place, whether people go to chemists or do certain actions. We need to use these technologies more and more to help us deliver better health, prevention and treatment.
I guess the follow-on from that fascinating discussion is if any of us knew exactly who we could talk to ensure that the improvements in the last 18 months in some of the processes we just discussed persist, it would be a little easier. I don't know who those decisions come from, really.
Well, ministers advised by senior civil servants. And so, I mean, a good move would be for the BMA, if it was enlightened, and I'm not sure how enlightened it is, I just don't know, to write on behalf of doctors and say, we need to bake this in and do more. The Academy of Medical Sciences could do something on it. But Matt Hancock's a local MP. Why don't you invite him to Addenbrooke's and show him what you've been able to do and say, we mustn't lose this. And when we know who the new chief scientific advisor is, you'll want to invite that person to see, because that will be a very strong voice on all these issues. So it's about campaigning. I mean, I campaigned very hard on these issues in the department, but you will need to help them understand, help them do it. It's also worth, possibly not for another few years, but it's always worth talking to the opposition, because they ask questions in Parliament and they one day will come into power. And if we've educated them as we've gone, it can make a difference.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions lined up. I'm going to pose you a question now from Malcolm Cameron, who's one of our consultant maxillofacial surgeons, and then Professor Sharon Peacock, who is going to ask a question. So Malcolm was was interested in you mentioning burnout, which you mentioned right at the beginning of your initial talk, and he was wondering if this sort of concept is acknowledged in what he's called the corridors of power, and how it might be mitigated against.
I haven't been into the corridors of power since the middle of March last year because of lockdown, though I'm talking to them all the time. I know, because I do talk to people, that they are recognise this is a potential issue. I don't know whether they understand how tough it has been. I mean, Chris Whitty must, because over Christmas he was on the wards at UCH, and what to do. And I do think, again, it needs some quantification and some thinking, because there are levels, aren't there? There's real psychiatric problems, but there's, I just can't go on, I need a holiday. And I'm really worried that when July, August comes, and COVID should be down at that point, they'll then demand that no one has holidays because you've got to catch up on all the waiting lists. And someone needs to be saying to them, actually, you're going to have to let us have some breathing space, even if it's in rotation. But someone's got to point it out, would be my argument.
Thank you. Sharon, did you want to ask a question as well?
Yeah, I'd love to, thank you. Mine takes you back to Athena Swan. Now, I remember, Sally, when your letter arrived at the BRC, that caused quite a stir, I have to say, and it said, if you haven't got your Silver Athena Swan by the time it's time to apply for your BRC, don't bother, sort of thing. And that was an interesting day, I have to say, but was very welcome from my perspective. But I'm interested to hear you say that it's become very bureaucratic, and I have to say that it seemed to make a difference initially, but then it became a sacred cow in that it looked as if it was becoming very bureaucratic and less effective, but it was quite difficult to challenge because you couldn't say, well, what's the evidence that Athena Swan is actually working now? And my sense over the last year is that, if anything, we've gone backwards in terms of equality and diversity because we're all so busy doing what we have to in response. And I think that, you can see committees and groups and so on being set up in a way that wouldn't have been done previously, because you'd say, well, is this fair and is it equitable? People are kind of grabbed out for those people who they think can actually get the job done. And I think that in the fog of war, that's fine. But as we move out of that, I think that we need to do more. And actually, there's going to have to be a big push around equality and diversity. So my question, Sally, is, what should we do next if we need to move on to something? What would your suggestion be that we could do that could actually make a difference now?
Well, I think the first thing is to have a look at where Athena Swan is now, because there's been an external review and they know it's too tick boxy and bureaucratic. And have they come up with something that actually would be useful? Because I do know that the Department of Health has withdrawn, you can tell I've left, can't you, the necessity to have it for their funding, but they've said you've got to produce evidence. Well, if the reformed version is not too bureaucratic, it would be the ideal and easiest way of producing that evidence. But I think you also have to be quite clever about it. I mean, I remember chatting to Boris when he was Vice-Chancellor, and he was absolutely horrified by the lack of women clinical academics. And he was very proud of the fact that he had told departments that he would publish the numbers put forward for promotion to professor by gender. And he said that overnight changed what was happening. And I do know that simple things like that can make a difference, and that the NHS is actually generally much better than medical schools and still about diversity and gender and everything. So it's looking for those simple things and seeing whether Athena Swan has become sufficiently unbureaucratic that actually you might as well do it to prove the point for the next BRC round, or how are you going to show that you're delivering on that diversity? Because they were careful to say, I know they sent it to me in embarrassment, so I wouldn't say anything publicly. they were careful to say that you have to prove that you are working to improve gender and diversity balance.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Our trust chair, Mike Moore, is part of the group, and Mike pointed out that Matt Hancock's been here a few times, as has the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. But I think, Mike, I don't know if you want to ask the question yourself about the balance, or if you want me to do that.
No, happy to do, Justin.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I really agree the point about the granularity and complexity of data that Facebook, etc., have, and how that could be really powerful in terms of aiding population health strategies and stuff, actions. But one of the lessons we've learned, I suppose, through COVID has been we've not really, as a country, got the balance between what's done locally and decided locally and what's decided nationally right, nor necessarily have we always got the balance between the technical solution and other solutions to some issues. So I just wondered, do you have any views as to how we might marry those more effectively, the national and the local? I can imagine Facebook isn't one going to negotiate this and won't negotiate this other than once. So the negotiation and stuff like that, the application of it will often be at very local level.
So I share your view. And interestingly, I played it out when I set up the Biomedical Research Centre competition, because my view for that sort of experimental medicine is no central committee could decide what would be best done and who were the best people to do it. We had to agree who were ace teams with a bit of a track record, some great ideas, and give them a good dollop of money and then see how they delivered. And it worked. I mean, it's been just wonderful. So I do believe that expertise matters and localism has a role. And I also think there's something about letting 1,000 flowers bloom, but then somehow you have to join it up as a whole. And I think through COVID, between all of you, from what I've seen, you've managed a reasonable balance on a lot of that. But it would be nice to, I think we need to move to a much more outcomes-based system where, you're not being judged on process, and I'd prefer you not to be paid for DRGs. I'd prefer you to be paid for outcomes of the population being cared for, and to work with the primary care people to make sure that happened. I think the Cambridge setup would probably deliver rather well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, well, that has been a fairly major priority for us for the last 2 or 3 years, and actually shown some results, some investment in primary care and leadership. So anyway, but that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Sally, it's obviously been an outstanding and very varied career to date. I just wonder, looking back, are there any things that you would have done differently with the benefit of hindsight, either sort of career moves or behavioral characteristics, or anything that, little gems you could give us for things you might have done differently, or actually none at all?
Well, I probably wouldn't have left quite so many dead bodies along the way, but hey, if you want to change things, you have to break a bit of china. And I forget, things quite quickly. So I hope a lot of people have come back and we've got on perfectly well. No, I think what I've done is seen opportunities and gone for them and said, I'd like to try that, or thank you for the opportunity, I will go and do that. And then brought my own thinking into it. But my own thinking has always been tempered by others. Some on this call may have been part of it. I can't see all the names. But for instance, on obesity, we kept getting stuck in government. And I set up 3 workshops for the policy teams, bringing in people from all over the UK, bringing in number 10 advisors and the Treasury to listen to researchers talking about what they knew and where they thought it was going, to see me model to the policy teams that you didn't have to know everything. It was all right to say, I didn't know that, or what would you advise, and to try and unblock things and move it forwards. I mean, there have been some funny hiccups. Alcohol guidelines was one. I knew that the previous alcohol guidelines from the ones that I did in about 2015, I would think, had suggested that men and women needed different amounts and everything. And I knew that we were getting an evidence base that showed that alcohol was probably more harmful than had been allowed for in those guidelines. But I didn't really want to go there. I was busy and had lots on my plate. And then Prime Minister Cameron told me that he'd announced in Parliament, because some of his MPs wanted it, that I was going to redo the guidelines. So I recruited the other CMOs, and we agreed to use 2 panels of experts, one led by Teresa Marteau on the behavioural and how to write the guidelines, another led by, I can see him from the London School, on the evidence, but it involved Ian Gilmore and people. And then we kind of put it together. And when we'd finished, the Prime Minister was not best pleased, nor were my ministers, because of course we said men and women should have the same, and that you really shouldn't drink on successive days, and you should ideally have 3 days free in a week, etc., etc. And that wasn't what they wanted. So I was told that it wasn't what they wanted. And I said, well, you shouldn't have asked me to do them. If you'd asked me what the outcome would be, I could have guessed it would be there because I knew the evidence. And then we had one minister who said to me, well, I'm being absolutely eaten up alive by the MPs who asked for it. You're going to have to meet them. I'm not taking this. And I said, all right. So I walked into this meeting with these ministers, and before they could open their mouths, I said, so are you pleased? You demanded this. I knew where it would go. You got what you asked for. Are you pleased? And by the time I'd attacked them for being the perpetrators of the deed and making me do all this work, they actually did shut up, but it didn't go to bed. I then got the chief exec of the Portland Group, which is the alcohol kind of concern group from the alcohol industry, demanding to come to the CMO's regular meeting. We would meet 3-4 times a year. And I happened to be chairing it. And he started with, I caricature, but this is how I heard it. Dear young woman, you don't know what evidence is. They've done it all wrong. And you won't have had time to read it. And it's just wrong. And you need to retract it. And I waited till he'd done it. And then, well, I ate him for lunch. It wasn't very tasty. He could have done with a hair wash. But I mean, A, I had read every word. B, I was a Cochrane editor for a period. I've done systematic reviews and I knew exactly what was there. And he kept on fighting and fighting until I kicked him out. And the other CMOs sat there with their mouths open. They couldn't believe what was going on, but they didn't step in and join in. But anyway, he never came back. I don't know whether he's still there, silly fool.
Well, it's just before 7, and we've had an absolutely fascinating hour in your company. It's beholden on me to thank you on behalf of everybody who's been part of the call this evening, CUH, university colleagues, Papworth, etc. And Sally, thank you for joining us. We've really appreciated your insights, benefited from your wisdom and experience. And hopefully we'll see you again within the CUH family at some point. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you. And it's lovely to see all of you. And I hope it was interesting. Good.
It certainly was.
And thank you for the great job you all do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally. So thank you very much. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.